Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Hawthornden Lecture Theatre here at the Scottish National Gallery. I'm Alice Strang, and I'm a Senior Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the National Galleries of Scotland. And I've worked with Catherine Lampert, who is curator of the Paula Rego Obedience and Defiance exhibition, which opened just a couple of hours ago at the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art 2 along the road. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Catherine and Marina Warner, who together are going to give the opening talk of the Rego exhibition. Before we get started, however, could I please ask you all to turn your phones off or to silent? And also, we're not expecting a fire alarm practice, so if the alarm goes off, please exit using the nearest exit to you. There's two at the back and the one where you came in. So to introduce our prestigious speakers, Catherine Lampert is an independent curator and art historian. She has curated numerous exhibitions at the Hayward Gallery and the Whitechapel Gallery, where she was director for over a decade, and more recently at the Royal Academy, Tate Britain, the Kunstmuseum Bonn, and MUAC in Mexico City. The subjects of these exhibitions ranged from old to contemporary masters, including Auguste Rodin, Honoré Daumier, and Anish Kapoor. Her publications include books about Francis Alice, Ewan Uglow, Peter Doig, and Frank Auerbach, for whom she has sat every Friday evening for the past 41 years, apart from last night when she was with us to celebrate the opening of the exhibition. She's currently working on the catalogue raisonné of paintings by Lucien Freud. Catherine has known Paula Rego since 1981, and the exhibition Obedience and Defiance is accompanied by a catalogue written by Catherine, which is available in the gallery shop and makes a wonderful Christmas present. And she is talking today with Marina Warner, a novelist, critic, and cultural historian. She's the author of many works of fiction and non-fiction, including critical studies, novels, and children's books. Much of her writing is concerned with an analysis of the mythology, folklore, and archetypes surrounding the feminine throughout history, as expressed in art, literary text, and fables. She is Professor of English and Creative Writing at Birkbeck College, University of London, and is President of the Royal Society of Literature. Marina met Rego at Rego's solo exhibition at the Serpentine Gallery in 1988 in front of the Vivian Girls painting, and since then they've worked together on several occasions, including on a Jane Eyre book and a nursery rhymes book. And Marina's latest publication, called The Forms of Enchantment, Writings on Art and Artist, was published last year and includes an essay on Rego. Catherine and Marina are happy to answer questions and to take contributions at the end of their talk, in which they will discuss their friend and colleague, Paula Rego, and her exhibition, Obedience and Defiance. Thank you.
I thought I'd just explain for a second our approach to this next hour. We're obviously here to celebrate the fantastic achievement of Paula Rego, and with the exhibition nearby, I think most people will do that through looking at individual pictures, which are seen so well in the Dean galleries. And we're not here, of course, to explain or to interpret each work. We'll make comments that are our responses, certain familiarity and background, but Paula's work, in my experience, I think in Marina's, you keep looking and something else comes out. Either she identifies, last night she talked to me about a little monkey bowl that she bought on the Essex Road in London and what it means to her. She herself is rediscovering paintings and remembering works from the experience in the studio and elsewhere. The exhibition has this, in order not to, both for the space and for focus, has a sort of, as it were in the big word, meaning of the word political, has that orientation. And so we began, the images you'll see on the screen, we're not doing a lecture, which is image by image. They'll keep rolling, but they do have some chronological order as well as topics and themes, and one of them begins with her experience of growing up in Portugal in the war years and after, during the regime of Salazar. But I'm going to not continue to talk, but Marina, you begin, perhaps, too.
Well, first of all, this is a conjunction of two remarkable women, because Paula Rego is revealed by Catherine's extraordinarily sensitive and actually very kind of tender. It's an empathy she has with Paula's work that has given an extraordinary thread through an oeuvre that is characterized by tremendous vitality and variety and changes and shifts. But nevertheless, the exhibition, which you will have the great joy to see if you haven't seen it already, and the great distress to see too, because there are many, many, many emotions in it, begins with the political paintings that are not, as it were, immediately personal of the early 60s, or there's something of one of the 50s. And this sets a kind of a frame for us to see how deeply Paula Rego's work connects from a personal feeling into the larger world. Again and again, she brings off with almost prophetic perceptions of what is actually happening, of the tensions on a person like herself, and how that is mirrored in the shifts and anguish and troubles and torments of the larger world. I mean, we can be a bit more precise, but so here, you know, this Salazar, the dictator in Portugal, and you probably want to comment a little on how different the approach is here, the actual formal approach.
Paula, although the pictures from the 60s were actually physically made in the large paintings in London. She's working on the floor. She's using, as you can see, collage. She's drawing. There are sources from... what's happened? It's the last image. I've gone to the last image. That's not so clever.
Yes.
But then they'll just progress, I guess. I think they're supposed to be on a loop. And I'll find out. Yes, good.
She said she transitioned from exactly playing on the floor as a child to painting on the floor.
And to being on her hands and knees and growling and cursing. And last night when I asked Paula how her days go, she's still going to the studio, and she says, I'm drawing, and I'm hoping to get better at drawing. And that's, there's Paula at nearly 85. Yes. But here, as we mentioned, there, if you begin to dissect works and you hear commentary, the picture on the right is the exile, and it's partly about her father and her grandfather, liberals who were in despair throughout the whole 20th century, really. Her father died in 1966, at whether they were ever going to be escape from this authoritarian regime. And I think the word authoritarian you mentioned the military, which of course were a heavy presence in Portugal at that time, had a long-term effect on her.
You quote her as saying that her chief interests have been in power games and hierarchies at some point in the catalogue, and I don't know when she said that, but of course that is a common thread. But what's interesting is the intensity of this fierceness that erupts from the beginning and pretty much sustained throughout. I mean, you see it here in these forms, so these little almost twisting vortex-like forms that...
And we, of course, every good painting, when in another situation, you read in a different way. So from Milton Keynes, where the exhibition began, and there's these beautiful high-ceiling, long sort of enfilade of spaces, to the more, historic context, not only because it's part of the National Galleries of Scotland, but the rooms in Edinburgh, where across the road there's the great Surrealist collection. So there are artists, we were talking just a moment ago, that you see echoes in Paula's work.
Yes, and I think that these also, when she moves into realism, or what looks like realism, one tends to be misled and think that one isn't in the same kind of dream world that I think one is in here. Because she's changing relations of bodies to one another and placing them in... It's a little bit like when you remember a dream, there are very huge things that happen, and they're salient, and they give you a feeling of disgust or terror. And I think that she's really...
guilt.
Or guilt, yes.
Yeah.
And I think she's often quite close to that. She creates forms that aren't actually placed in a real world, though they are realistically depicted later. But they still continue with this surrealist motive of actually plunging deep into the psyche, into understanding the unconscious.
And there in the exhibition in a desk case, we have a couple of photographs of Paula in the 60s, and of course the wonderful film by Nick Willing will be playing in one of the rooms, Paula's son. And there is Paula in 1965 exhibiting these works in Lisbon. And, you know, they are so daring. There's Paula in a sort of op-art jumper, looking absolutely beautiful and charming, and
Yes.
this charismatic figure of the times. And she says she also is, she's attracted when she does the picture. Will come up in a moment. The imposter. There's a little bit of pop art in her. Seeping into her work, as well as comics and all sorts of other sources. But it's a very, in some ways, quite risky thing to be making pictures that are so explicit and could be censored, or she could be in political trouble. And you have to be reminded, in a way, when we go back to this period, that it was more difficult thing than nowadays for an artist to make a political statement.
Yes, and perhaps we don't need to say this, but it really was also more isolated to be a woman artist. I mean, she's not a woman artist, but she's an artist who's a woman, and that was a much harder position, especially in the climate of the Slade at the time.
Yes.
And with her, her principal colleagues are kind of Lucian Freud, Michael Andrews, and the domination of the male is a profound current in her work. And as your title suggests, there's resistance, there's defiance to obeying this authoritarian, hierarchical presence of the male, and the natural assumption of preeminence. But at the same time, underneath that is a contradictory sense of the extreme vulnerability and weakness of the male. I mean, we've got quite a lot
we need
of...
to keep moving the images. Should I be doing this? Anyway, how do we do this? No? Oh, good. That's it. I'll do that way. That's simple.
So this one is not actually in the show, is it? Because
no, it's at the Tate Gallery, so it will be available when she has a show there in 18 months, I presume. But it's one of the pictures where she's specifically looking at the effect of poverty on now on the universe, but also specifically in Portugal in these years. The barefoot fireman, she and her family encounter in a village in the north of Portugal during a sort of New Year's weekend, and she's transformed into this work.
I mean, as Catherine was saying, the family was, I mean, some of you know this already, but the family was secular, and he was an electrical engineer, is that right?
Yes.
Yes, and she had an unexpected upbringing, because she was actually sent to a French school because it was a non-religious establishment. But then that tension, I think, has also continued until the very more recent works, between, as it were, the secular sitting room of the family, with its customs and its resistance to the regime, and then, as she's always said, with great gratitude and acknowledgement, the servants. When she was mostly in the kitchen with the servants, and it's there that she got a lot of the material, the Catholic sense of values, above all the Catholic sense of womanhood, of what it meant to be a woman, of how, and subjugation, wiles, beauty,
wiles, getting around things. In
beauty, and accompanied by guilt. but also a great store of stories, which she was very enriched by.
Absolutely.
So,
I'm not sure I'm getting the hang of this.
maybe, I think they're not. It's not moving. That's the problem.
No. Can we? I think when I went do this. Oh, okay. Now we're.
Oh yes. So this.
We inserted this, Paula, apart from working on those collages, we're making fantastic works. This is oil on canvas, but, about the body, about her internal feelings. In this case, birth, literally the kind of spasms of delivery of a child, being a very physical experience, even an erotic sexual experience. And just when you might think you could explain Paula in a civilized way, she never wants us to do that. There's always a retort of great strength.
And people often use, I think you've used the word visceral. I mean, there's a visceral sense of going deep into her sensations, her physical, her embodiment. I mean, the flesh is present in the paint. And it's going backwards now.
Yeah.
Oh, there we are, yes.
Good.
And that's related, that idea that is very near to abjection sometimes, very near to a feeling of degradation, I think comes through in the identification, which is very spontaneous and very kind of immediate and not at all grotesque, but at the same time it acknowledges in animals the similarity of ourselves. I mean, there's not much humanism here, It's
No, and using animals there's her husband Vic spoke of having a toy theater when he was a child, and having just 4 characters, a monkey and a bear and so forth, and she in her imagination through drawings, this the early 80s, recreates some of her own personal and family dilemmas, as Vic's multiple sclerosis is making him physically weaker and obviously much more frustrated, and she and her family are more. It's more necessary to have a certain kind of care, and every person, especially artists who are their life is often mainly in the studio, have that desire to. Both affection and concern and resentment for obligations. And so I think the topic of caring and caring for dependence is a theme that is early on in her work and is rarely addressed in any artist's work.
And the fact that the powerless in society, children, women, servants, the poor, actually have a huge concentration of influence because they control the domestic space. She's very concerned with this clash. And when I think Vic got ill, his helplessness comes out in these paintings with these powerful little girls.
Yes.
Stocky,
strong
yes,
girls.
Yes. And an undercurrent of mischief, and we never quite know. And she herself has often told different stories about these,
which is wonderful.
Yes.
We have here, for instance, Marco Livingston in the audience in front of me, who's teased out of Paula very often one interpretation. There was a wonderful catalogue exhibition in Madrid where she puts down an explanation, and then somewhere else she comes up with a new interpretation.
Yes. And this mischievousness is part of the power of the little girl, and the make-believe world, the world of alternative possibilities. It's not a straightforward world. It's a world where you can fantasize yourself transformed in one direction or another.
And of course, one of the great moments of Paula's, as it were, career is when she begins to do this in etching with Paul Coldwell and starts to make these superb black and white etchings from nursery rhymes. And that's the first time you wrote about her work, isn't it?
Yes. It was actually the birth of, I think, of her first grandchild.
That's right.
Yes,
Carmen.
because in Portugal she didn't have nursery rhymes. There were lots of fables and fairy tales and folk tales and terrifying kind of ghost stories and things that she knew from that period, from her own childhood. But when she came across these, she came with unfamiliar eyes, so she was struck by the extreme strangeness of them, and that delighted her. And she did, and some of them are aquatints, I think, aren't they? So
Yes,
there's a kind of...
etching and aquatint.
Yes,
yeah.
and so you have here really a Goya sequence derived and inspired by these stories, these strange... there's a Baba Black Sheep as well, where the little girl is hugging this immense ram.
Yeah, absolutely. Or she puts the features of her friends. For instance, the frog is a writer and man with wine chop, Rudy Nasser, and the figure of the figure in the middle is the painter Ewan Uglow. So it's she can impose into these wonderful etchings, and Polly, the one of Polly and Suki, the gigantic one, and the small men. And
yes. This is the kind of example of what I meant about it being based really on dream proportions, and to some extent on dream time. So here you have tiny little powerful men who are these sort of policemen or perhaps soldiers with this gigantic Polly, and the women looming, the young women looming as the powerful agents of nurture and care, but also poison and danger. And but the time sequence is also similarly compressed. I mean, this is not like a play. This is more like a glimpse in a dream. Sorry.
In 1990, Paula was appointed the first associate artist at the National Gallery. Colin Wiggins, it was a new program, and that gave her a studio in the building. And it also, it was just, this picture was something in progress as she was appointed, or just before she was, and she was beginning to do these large interior scenes. They're very much like perhaps a novelist would begin to, before they can begin to write. I was reading a book of essays that Orhan Pamuk wrote a couple of years ago, delivered as lectures, that in order to begin one of his novels, the Turkish novelist, he has to imagine the interior and the room and the protagonists. And Paula, as we saw from the picture of the family, but she's continuing, is doing this in her own way, with costume, with as Marina just mentioned, the difference in scale between the young woman being introduced into society, a marriageable, product of the family, something to offer, and the expectations of behavior and a future role, very tight expectations.
Yes, embodied here in the actual tightness of the bodice and the sort of limp pre-debutante stage of child in the sofa or in the armchair, who's kind of limp because she's going to be kind of coerced into this new social form, which we see pretty much fully realized in the tiny figure on the right in her corseted figure-hugging dress. So custom, expectation, convention, and all the things that Paula never seems to have absorbed at all.
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely.
She's very aware of them, but she somehow escaped them. It's quite extraordinary. She absorbed so many things with sort of wonderful spontaneity. She's so quick to pick up, gestures and so forth. But convention, she just.
I mean, she did mentioned again to me last night that when she was supposed to be attending, classes and working in the studio at the Slade, this is the early 50s, the one thing that she sort of kept her going was to go off to Leicester Square and go into a cinema and buy a ticket, not even knowing what was going to be on the program that afternoon. And of course, in that age of 50s cinema, some of these roles and heroes and dramas.
Yes.
In the National Gallery, of course, she's really surrounded by and curious and fascinated and learning by the pictures and making this fantastic mural, which is in the restaurant of the National Gallery still, and borrowing from painters like Crivelli and Zubran, particularly the Catholic aspect comes again.
Yes, I mean, I think it really catalyzed her return to very realistically and fully depicted scenes, because, you know, all around her in the National Gallery were things that are completely imaginary, phenomena that are imaginary, like angels, but done by Renaissance artists so that they are, you know, fully present and in every kind of detail, as if they were in the room and you knew them. And I think that pitched her into this tremendous work of fully realized scenes in which the massiveness of bodies, even if it's quite an imaginary scene, become very palpable.
And something like, and also she's ready to show very clearly that she's going to put the woman in the role of the artist. Here, the Virgin Mary comes out of the picture by Philippe de Campagne in the National Gallery, Joseph's Dream, and sits on the stool and takes up her hand and draws her friend sitting in the armchair behind her.
With this absorption and absolute attachment to the task. I think we've seen quite a lot of wonderful fabrics too, because her painterly skill, or not painterly sometimes now, has she moved into pastels?
Not quite.
Not quite.
Yeah, next year.
It's remarkable textures, extraordinary, the variety of feel for fabric, and I think the National Gallery probably inspired, stimulated some of that. Yes,
I mean, Paula herself is pretty keen on shoes and clothes and you know, excitement. She is, though, certainly here, and in a moment I'll talk more, going some way back to her sort of conventional training of drawing and her natural ability to draw. Although, as I mentioned earlier, she's always thinking she'll get more ability next week, next month. It's not a finite quality, but this you can see in the exhibition preparatory drawings, like this terrific one of the angel.
I mean, I think this also brings out something that she responds to without resistance, perhaps, and that is a quality of transcendence in some religious art. I mean, and there is that. I mean, it's both very grounded in human sufferings and human experience and the actual state of the flesh, but the whole assembly and intensity of the eventual painting or work aims at transcendence. I mean, it's the word she's actually used. I mean, she's very modest, as you know. I mean, she makes no claims for herself. It's quite extraordinary. When you say she's sort of now still trying to learn to draw. I mean, she's one of the great draftswomen, artists.
And I feel, and I hope you might feel some of the same when you go to the exhibition, your next thought is, you know, and at one point, Paula may be on the walls of the National Gallery here or in the collection. She belongs in a tradition, a Western tradition, but she'll have changed. She'll change the sort of parameters quite dramatically from some of her predecessors, particularly male predecessors. I put this in because I wanted to remind us several times of her great quality of humor. One of her tutors when she was at the Slade and then future friends was the painter who died 2 years ago, Patrick George, who is a great painter of outdoors, of landscapes. But this is Patrick. This is a tree painting Patrick. She's done this for fun and sent it to him. And she did this also with the idea of measured drawing, which of course is something we associate with William Coldstream and with the painter Ewan Uglow, who's the monkey on the right, and Leon Kossoff, awkward, never happy with his work. There's terrific two pictures hanging in Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art 1 at the moment. But it's really what I'm pointing out is that she's at a certain moment, which is to do with these Dog Woman series, which begin 4 years after the death of Victor Willing. She's still, and perhaps more even intensely, in the state of mourning. She wonders how she can express the conflicted feelings of loss, but also good and bad experiences, and she gets Leela, who had worked with Vic as a carer and studio assistant, to start posing for her. And this is something that began in '92 and continues to the present. And quite, I don't really know, another parallel of such collaboration.
And Leela's expressiveness, caught so brilliantly by Paula again and again. I mean, if you look at the paintings, each one of the works, each one, and look at the feet, you can read a whole kind of, yes, you see up on the left-hand side there. Is that Leela? No, that's
yes.
not. Is it?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, there was certainly
So,
one at the bottom, the
yes,
target.
Yes. And then her feet in this one. I mean, it's very remarkable how characterful the position, but also sometimes the texture, like the dirty feet here, which is part of the sense.
And a real body, a body that isn't in any way idealized. It's not a, it's not a body you think of, this is a Titian's body or a Cranach's body.
And it's not nude.
No, and she doesn't want it. The image I just showed with the slip falling off, she said to her mother, "What should I do? Should I keep this slip on there, or she should be nude?" And her mother said, "No, keep a little bit of it on. It's just falling off." And she's falling off the bed. And she said, "Oh, that's good." That relieved her of the pressure to make a nude seemed an eternal picture, mythological, like our great Titian's. And she was apprehensive of trying to enter that tradition.
I mean, she wanted then. I mean, in this period, she was responding, I think, to some of the feminist calls for women to reoccupy the positions that they had occupied in traditional art, of muse and beauty and so forth, and actually bring their own personal knowledge of what it was to have a female body into the works of art, into the representations. I mean, I don't want to confine her to that feminist impulse, but it's successfully there, very successfully there.
When, of course, Paula's known too for using as a kind of trigger for her work something from literature, or also from film, but particularly from literature, and or in this case from the fairy tale, not fairy tale, what do you call it, folk tale of Snow White and her stepmother, and when we were speaking a while ago, we were mentioning that there's implicit is the progression toward, from adolescence towards sexual awareness to relationships between the father and the stepmother, and I can't think of another. It's done so delicately. This is Snow White on the prince's horse, and the analogy between female sexuality and the experience of riding and love of horses and teenage girls, and she's just drawn that in a very particularly in the drawing sometimes in a very light touch. It's never ground into.
But last night Simon Groom said that thank you to Paula for making me feel uncomfortable.
Yes, that's right. yes.
And the disquiet. I mean, this thing of going in deep and confronting as it were, the real experience of bodies does sometimes produce images that are purposefully troubling. And you were talking about her way she owns up to things and the way she doesn't censor. And say some more about that, because it's very interesting how bold she is in what she confronts in something like Snow White.
And in Snow White, and in it'll come out in the film, but even in other pictures where she's the woman is implicit in the transgressions. That there's most women want to be to attract male interest, and the handling of the relationship. We see things that you could now rephrase as images of domination. There's the stepmother humiliating this kind of stocky,
Snow White figure.
Snow White by inspecting her knickers. And what is, I mean, who's ever thought of making that into a
Yes.
grand, wonderful picture?
Yes. I mean, this has got, to my sort of former Catholic eyes, you know, a very strong emphasis on the necessity for purity. And I think it has hints not only of forbidden sexuality, the stepmother wondering if this is the child is now pubescent and now, you know, but also about menstruation, which of course is a great taboo, and the sign of the, you know, fallen Eve, very much the, you know, literally known as the curse. And I think, you know, here she's exploring that in a way that's probably unprecedented in art, actually.
Certainly. And the competition between the mother and daughter for the attention of the father, or in this case, the stepmother. One great experience for Paula, and in her words, the only time she reacted specifically felt compelled to make a series of works that would be distributed in a widespread way, was when the referendum in 1998 in Portugal, or 97 I think, failed to pass to legalize abortion, and there was a low turnout, and that was one of the disappointing elements. But it was also, she felt it was time to represent the experience of a variety of women who were obliged to have backstreet abortions, and she, in some ways, she said that she approached it almost like doing a nude painting in a studio in a kind of cubicle, asking somebody to pose. But of course, you know, the subject is looking directly at the artist and therefore at the viewer too, and not in a aspect of necessarily of shame, of the pain and the trauma, but not of they're not shocking in a descriptive way.
Yes, her powers of graphic representation are always concentrated on these expressive limbs. She doesn't do she doesn't do explicit full frontal at all.
No.
I mean, there's amazing for someone who is so, in a way, disturbing and shocking. She's actually got great delicacy in her reserves about what is shown, how. I mean, the humiliation is seen from outside rather than. The humiliation is seen with sympathy for the person, rather than us being made to look at her in a way that she can't see herself.
I think ever victims. They're never seen as somebody that you should feel sorry for. They're someone who made their own decisions, and the only thing that Paula is condemning is the necessity, particularly for women who didn't have the money or the opportunity to have any kind of safe clinical treatment, the risks they were taking.
And I think she, you know, you were saying about the tensions between women, the rivalries between Snow White and Stepmother, and I think here also begins a theme that comes quite often, which is that women are forced by the constraints of society to do harm to one another.
Yes, I think that's
because the
important.
abortionists are women usually. So I mean, there's sometimes men, but on the whole, she sees this as a drama of one, and also the people against abortion, the people who didn't vote for abortion or didn't go to the polls, are also women, and that comes later in some of the up-to-date work on trafficking, child trafficking, and so forth. And that's one of the reasons she liked fairy tales so much, because fairy tales go absolutely to the heart of that. They are so interested in the tensions between women in their weaker state for for competition for survival and so forth. I mean, it was one of the great problems that when I wrote about fairy tales I had to look at. Why are they misogynistic? Well, they're mostly told by women.
Why women against
women against each other.
Yeah.
Even though it's a woman's art.
She reminds us, though, in the film and other times that that almost every experience that she makes pictures about, in some form, she's experienced herself. You know, and she identifies with the subjects. You know, that's the reason she puts the woman, one is a schoolgirl, she went off to John Lewis and bought costumes and to remind that often this might be an experience of somebody who's 15 or 17 years old, and then equally someone who's in a sort of little cocktail dress and is going through this ordeal. And she made, they'll come up, this is image out of order, but she also, she made, it will come out in a second, a series of etchings and for wide distribution, so that the people who might not see the paintings of this theme might see them. Of course, the pictures I remember when they were shown at the Talbot Rice Gallery soon after they were made, and quite something going up those stairs and coming into the long triptych, which is now in Kendal. But widespread, it was one of the purposes, of course, of printmaking, is this larger distribution.
Just about her sort of personality, it's really quite extraordinary that she has this very sort of almost savage sense of how cruel the world is, and people cruel to each other. But she tends to depict it when she tells you about with a smile. She fends it off with a smile, and I have never known her be herself bad-tempered or cruel. I mean, I don't know. I've never. She's the most. You could not put the person she is together with this extraordinary vision she has. It's really an extraordinary difference. Her warmth and generosity and her compassionate. So I think one has to bear that in mind, because that's all underneath these rather frightening confrontations with reality.
And she's not someone who can plan her work. She has to go through in the studio. I mean, a moment ago we saw a drawing for the central figure for the painting on the right, Company of Women, who's Tony Rudolph, the writer and editor, who has been one of her very important model sitters for some time. But when she goes into making these pictures at this period in the 90s, and by this time Paula's in her late 50s, so she's doing the work at a time when many times Creer says, oh, this is a sort of dormant period in someone's life, but it certainly wasn't in hers, that decade of the 90s and beginning of the 2000s. But she doesn't really know what's going to happen in the picture. She may get the setup and in the studio, but until she goes herself into a kind of dark tunnel, and this is what we don't see, she feels it. So as Marina just said, socially she's keen on knowing what one's response is and having a two-way exchange. She's not a kind of arrogant artist, the contrary. But when she's in the studio, she's she's had psychotherapy. That's a very important part. She's plunging in, and she's picking up. Sometimes it's just a small element to put into a picture. She and her husband Vic called it Rousseau's dog. She suddenly needs one element to make the whole picture work. But it's quite it's quite extraordinary that she calls it the long dark tunnel, and suddenly there's light. But they're formidable experiences to make these. They may be triggered by a narrative, but her storytelling is very internal, isn't it?
She likes. I mean, Tony Rudolph tells us, or used to tell her lots of stories of the plots of, and then she would want to read them or have them on audible, on tapes. But actually, it wasn't so much reading it herself as the images conjured up by encounters with cinema or whatever, these out in the world. I think that's quite common with artists, actually, that they quite like for the material to be channeled to them, then they can do with it what they want.
Absolutely, and rather than just you think of the postcards on the wall, but then hers, as you say, it was often the voice. She listening to opera or listening to theatre.
Yes, we should mention that, because of course there is some kind of emotional equivalent with fado and opera in her work, I think, quite strong. The extremes of passion. Julian Barnes, the writer, said after he lost his wife that the only thing he could do was go to opera, because it was the only thing that was extreme enough to capture how he felt.
And lose oneself.
Yes. And I think there's an element of that in her work.
And this, what a kind of strange, this is of course the same person in both pictures. One case he's turned into a woman with his wig, and and in the other, it comes from a wonderful book I recommend, and I know Alice is going to give a talk about Paula Rego and Paula's books and literature in a while here, I think. And I recommend actually looking at this Crime of Father Amaro, this wonderful book by Eka de Queiroz, can't say the word, which is, she hasn't followed the plot. It's set in a provincial town in, it was published in 1875. And of course it's undermining it as the sort of anti-clerical theme. But it begins with the young Amaro, who's at this point supposed to be only about 10, being kind of cosseted by the women in a household, and then goes to the next phase where he's sort of forced into the priesthood, and it's her interpretation, which departs from the actual episodes of the book, but here's one of the preliminary drawings. It's a fantastic recreation, and then it comes to this glorious picture.
Yes, but about the company of women we just saw, I think is a good example of where the emotions are being communicated to us, but at the same time withheld, and that there are exchanges of glances, sometimes with us, but also between characters in the paintings, which intimate that they are having all kinds of thoughts that are not on the surface, but we can't read them. And that is very involving. We're deeply involved in that. It contributes to the sense of undercurrents and unease, and people almost plotting to how they're going to survive, how they're going to extricate themselves.
And Paula's ability to, at this point, she is working in pastel stick with paper adhered to sort of an aluminium background to make it. And she's working, it's hard work, putting up first green grounds and adding flesh tones, pink tones, to create these figures, and also to create the fantastic textiles. But those textiles in the picture we just saw, the sort of semi-transparent, sort of almost like a nightgown of the young woman on the right. It communicates her her curiosity about this boy and about transition from young woman to woman, and it's often expressed not necessarily in the action or the face, but in something to do with something very tactile.
Yes, and of course the cross-genderedness of the model in both those last paintings is important to her and to this one, because here, in a sense, she's in a male role. She's now playing. Lila here is a sort of angelic figure with a sword and a sponge, and it's a kind of powerful inhabiting, taking over the body of a kind of archangel, and so I think that's runs very deep in Paula's commitment that gender isn't actually a prison. I mean, the society society creates the definitions that make the prison, but the actual self is very fluid between genders.
And also, not necessarily, you might think it's all about competition, to be as, be given as much attention as a male artist, and the grievances of representation in museum collections or whatever, and which are now brought to the fore, or reputation of artists. But it was also the fact that in London in the 90s, there were a number of fantastic artists who were loosely called figurative artists, like the School of London. And in particular, in 1993, there was the display of Lucian Freud's naked self-portrait, where he's holding in one hand a palette, in the other hand a palette knife, and in very much the same position as Angel. And far from it being necessarily something that Paula complains about, this is Lucian Freud getting more attention, pictures on display now in the Royal Academy, it was a kind of a spur to increase her ambition and to carry on doing it in absolutely her way, with very particular nuance.
But here, the kind of the sheen of that skirt and the absolute sumptuousness of the work on it. I mean, she's got such sensuousness in her execution. But I like this combination of the sword and the sponge, because it reminds me of Louise Bourgeois saying that when she felt in a rage with things, she wanted to cut.
Yeah.
And when she felt benign, she wanted to stitch. And it seems to me that here you have Paula, through her alter ego, Leela, slashing, piercing, cutting with her right hand, and then with her left, the sponge, which is a painterly tool, and it's, she's soothing, she's dabbing, she's giving to drink, and they're actually both of them symbols of Christ, which of course totally buried. It's absolutely not a religious painting, but there's a lot of that reference and allusion in her work all the time.
And indeed, the sponge to wash. There are some terrific pictures too, like this etching. Which and when we mentioned her themes coming out, themes of depression and of despair and of utter, hopelessness of feeding the bottle to the child.
She made some wine labels.
Yes. Not the kind of wine labels.
They were not accepted, I think, by Chateau Lafite.
Right.
But this is connected to this trafficking sequence. I mean, the nursemaids who are so crushed and defeated that they give their babies, or mothers that are so crushed and defeated they give their babies wine to drink. It's connected to the trafficking, the women who take their children, sell them, and so forth. Or are forced to do that. And I think we've got some more of that.
And we have also one of the perhaps the second time when she responded to something in the news, which is the experience of FGM, female genital mutilation, and made works which were shown at the Thomas Corrin Institute along with other contributors, and then have a sort of dispersal. We have grand pictures like this.
Very famous picture, this. It was great. It created a sensation. Where was it? Where I saw that?
It was first at Spellbound in the Hayward Gallery.
Yes. Well, here, this is her most powerful expression of defiance against Disneyfication, isn't it? Because here are the ostriches from Fantasia, which is a comic sequence, but she's grounded it. She's turned it back into real girls.
And one particular, Leela 18 times, I think, in this diptych, and with the body that isn't designated by, authorities to be a ballerina.
Yes.
Yep.
And I think that's also connected to current issues about body size, body, thinness. All these things.
Genetics, people trying to defy.
The Instagram life problem.
Yes. We have just a few more images. This one's gotten stuck. Here we are. We just wanted to have a few images of her studio, particularly recently. This is from 2014, when she's begun to complement, human sitters with her dollies, as she calls them, her creations.
Which she makes herself, some of them.
Yes.
I mean, with help. It's very near where I live in London, actually, so I've been there quite often. It's extraordinary. There's not much, there's overhead light, but not any opening onto the street. So it's a really enclosed world. It in itself is a camera obscura, a sort of a chamber where the corridor you were talking about, the dark corridor.
And also the kind of, a studio itself, it might be to a visitor as a romantic place, but to an artist, it's a kind of workshop, and so she might have a bed and a screen and these figures, but she's the one who has to turn it into this very resonant picture. And two examples again of the things that become quite political: the Interrogator's Garden, which was done again for a particular commission, and War, from a photograph in The Guardian of the bombing during in the first Gulf War of
I think it's the most powerful.
Iraq War.
Yes, since Goya, one of the most powerful anti-war paintings. It's very large. It's made the slide makes it look smaller than it is. It's quite. I mean, it's large, isn't it? It's not as because isn't that the one on the left smaller?
A little bit, but not much.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
But this connects to her play, doesn't it? Because these are soft. These are sort of like soft toys. These are kind of the strewn, the animals that you might have in your nursery, and by moving them into the scene of carnage and destruction, it actually sharpens the horror.
Absolutely.
If they were real bodies, we would read it as a war photograph as it was originally from the papers, and we're so we're so numbed to those scenes that it might not have impinged. But with these baby rabbits having their throats cut, it somehow
and the blood coming out.
Yeah, it intensifies.
We're just going to finish with one, coming up to one triptych and a couple drawings, but they return, in my mind, a picture that's so grown on me in the last 6 months, which is the Pillow Man, and it has several, several kind of sources within it. One, of course, is the play by Martin McDonagh, which he went to the premiere in the early 2000s and worked from. But it also goes back to this relationship between a daughter and a father, and subject of much analysis, Jungian or whatever. But Paula taking in a very tender and the kind of, to me, and I think it would be to lots of people who identify with a parent, the sort of grief maybe 30 years later held inside one for the frustrations and disappointments perhaps of someone one's been close to. In this case, her father, who himself suffered from depression, but also from the despair to never see his country and his sort of released from this very repressive regime of Salazar.
The pillar. I mean, she was transported by seeing that play. I remember seeing her afterwards, and she felt that it was speaking to her, truly profoundly. I think she made friends with Martin.
She did indeed, and they exchanged stories, and her stories and some of his unpublished stories too were sent to her. But she combines the girl who wants to be Christ and scenes from Estoril during her childhood, her mother in the middle panel, on the beach at the background wearing a kind of swimming costume of that period.
And this grotesque pillow man she made herself.
And big black stockings stuffed with pillows and foam.
With deliberate shapelessness and sort of blobbiness, and in the story, which you don't really need to know, but it's nevertheless kind of a dark thread. The pillow man is the one who rescues you by encouraging you to commit suicide before your life unfolds with all its sufferings.
Yeah, what a subject to begin a work of art. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the comfort. The comfort of the soft body is actually a comfort of death, and it's really quite.
And a number of works. The figure in this case, it's the Pillow Man is sort of imagined, kind of on a sea or disappearing, and here literally in the foreground, you mentioned the small black children.
The two little children clinging to the boat. So this is it's 2009. It's a very, very early response to the refugee crisis, which is now so critical. And there they are, the little children clinging to the fragile skiff with this, tormented woman trying to save them.
We're just going to finish now with just two drawings, which are so much like Paula, their recent drawings. One disgust, one repugnance, not that recent, but quite recent. This is one of Paula's heroines, a real woman, not a nude, she's in her underwear, woman who perhaps has sinned, a woman that one can identify with, and the kind of personage that I can't find a comparative to in the whole history of Western art. I don't know whether you can quite.
No, but of course she did also, and you've got two examples in the show, two beautiful drawings of Mary Magdalene.
Yes. Those are terrific.
Yes, one wonderful one of Mary Magdalene getting drunk with all the cats.
And this is something she did. The owner of this particular drawing is someone that she got drunk with at a period when they both, that was the only solution to some of their traumas of their
Yes.
life. last one here.
Okay.
So that brings us to the end of what we're talking about.
And we could take some questions, perhaps.
I might just start by thanking you both very much indeed. I think we've all partaken in an extraordinarily generous sharing of their knowledge of Paula Rego as a person and of an artist, and we've been really lucky to learn about her work in a way that I think would be impossible to do otherwise. And I do hope that it has inspired you to go and see the exhibition. Now, we are ready for questions and also contributions. You may well know Rego's work, have your own personal response to it. Would anyone like to start us off? Just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone over to you. We'll take a question here and then we'll go back to the lady at the back centre.
Hi. First of all, I just want to say I'm really grateful for Rego's work being elevated and put before our eyes again, because I've been a long-time fan. And also, just to pay homage to you, Marina, as well, both you and Rego and artists like Bourgeois, I fell upon purely by accident throughout my life, and I've found women like you to be so valuable in helping shake loose my own thinking, my own chains from all the power games that we're born into. And so as a slightly younger woman, I'm also paying tribute to what has gone before, and I'm so glad that this comes up and is elevated to the place it should be, and is also talked about by women, two predominantly women. But to go back to, you mentioned about her element of caring, that addressing women's roles of caring and the conflict within this, which I found quite fascinating because it is so often suppressed. And I know certainly in contemporary literature we have the example of Rachel Cusk, who wrote her a life's work, which came under such fire and attracts almost repugnance indeed. And I just wondered if either of you have any thoughts on why this is so little seen, discussed and heard, and how Rego has actually blazed a trail like this, and yet she has been quite a lone star.
To start, I mean, I think it's we're of a considerable age, and we I started making exhibitions in the 70s and writing about artists, and behavior and expectations have changed, and so it's some of the latent, Paula says some of my best supporters, which I often used obedience, were men. So they were artists, Vic Willing, but also, and indeed William Coldstream, who gave her the first prize in 1954 at the Slade, and João Penlava, who said, stop cutting up her works, try to work on the whole together. So she cites a number of men who encouraged her to move on, and also, but there was a different kind of balance between a power balance and so forth in those years, and so she's, in a way, yes. When we look back, it's a fantastic. She's done her life experience, but we don't want to necessarily erase that and say it was all wrong. And for instance, Rachel Cusk wrote a very interesting article 10 days ago in the New York Times about the painter Celia Paul. Celia Paul and Paula Rego are very good friends and admirers of each other's work. And she wrote about Celia and Cecily Brown. And it's something I think you just have to keep, it's a constantly moving thing. It's not just about how many women are in a permanent collection or in a biennale. It's a dynamic, but certainly it's a much stronger dynamic than it might have been 30 years ago.
No, I think it's an very interesting observation that, in a sense, Rachel Cusk owned up to something which Paula herself had recognised and put before us before that, which is that women can be vicious in their roles of mother and, you know, the actual roles that we expect. And it's a kind of insight into Catholicism, which is making these demands. A Catholic country, a Catholic sort of dictatorship like Portugal when she was a child, making these demands on the angel in the house, the idea that the woman must be the matriarch, the virtuous, said modest, and so forth, chaste, etc. So
and faithful.
And faithful, yes.
Topics that are very hard to deal with.
Yes.
They can be done perhaps better in a novel, but are quite hard to deal with in art.
But I think there are differences in sensibility between artists in their media. You know, and I haven't read the one about caring, the Rachel Cusk, and she's a fine writer, stylist, but she's very cool compared to Paula. Paula is very warm. Whatever the feeling is, it might be disgust, it might be repugnance, it might be rage, but you're in the presence of a very hot, warm-blooded person who is deeply feeling. And I think what is frightening in some of the current tone, the voice that some women in resistance adopt, is that they think that honesty demands coldness, and it doesn't. You can be honest and hot. And Paula really is. She's passionate. And she understands things passionately and viscerally.
I think it's true. And she's not wiping out the morality or whatever of man because of the transgressions. She's assuming that it happens with both genders.
We had a lady, sort of towards the back in the middle, just with her hand up there. The mic's just coming up to you.
Actually, can I say that? Because the question of valuing things more, we left out what we were going to say about illustration.
That's absolutely true.
Yes.
No.
So why don't you say something about that? Because that's
you No,
because she transvalued. I mean, not only did she transvalued women's lumpy bodies, which she's very fond of, but she transvalued the media that had been previously despised. She loves caricature. She loves, you mentioned comic strips, but all the kind of 19th century magazine illustrators. She knows them all. You know, what are they called?
black and white in the Portuguese journals and fashion journals.
Yes, and she really, there's vernacular modes of expression. She admires them, but also absorbs them. She's used them.
And she'll put them in, when we were looking at the picture of the fitting, the woman in the large sort of like ball gown for her debut, in the background on the cabinet, there's a sort of shadowy, a little bit of a Renaissance scene or a something from a book of medieval work. And, she often has tucked that into, so you hardly
She
notice
thinks
it.
Rowlandson is a great artist, for example.
Gilroy, Gilray, and Daumier is a very famous art.
I just wanted to ask you about her use of pastel, which I find absolutely astonishing and fascinating in such large works. I do a bit of pastel work myself, try anyway, and I'm astounded at her use of pastel and just wonder what you feel that particularly brings to her work.
Well, she wanted to put a lot of pressure on, she found brushes a little bit floppy, and so she could put her whole strength, and it's a big effort, especially on that scale, to work, but she liked a stick of pastel, and also that she could add layers straight away. She didn't have to wait for something to slightly dry, might do an oil paint, but she could keep working and work it over, and then rub it out a bit and work over. So it was very liberating for her, rather than difficult to transform from oil and acrylic to pastel.
It's a kind of it's a painterly drawing technique, isn't it? Too. It's got it's a kind of you can draw with it, but at the same time
and she can build up layers. She can have a green background that flesh tones, and also the amazing highlights. I mean, maybe that is partly from cinematic or whatever, because up close they have and also often in reproduction, it's very difficult to get them not to break away into sort of blotches of white and to have this wonderful sense of the corporality of a figure.
I think we have time for one further question. Is there anybody else who would like to raise their hand and ask something? Yes, here at the front.
Okay.
Thank you.
You touched very briefly on the word shame,
Yes.
and I was very struck years ago, Paula, talking about feeling ashamed every time she makes a painting and has to show it, because they're so confessional, and yet there's no self-censorship. And I think that's one of the very powerful aspects of her work, that she lets out things that people don't normally talk about.
I totally agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. And also she's probably not guilty. She sort of knows that it's all right. So she doesn't actually internalize a sense of sin. But the shame is the social thing. Yeah, and she certainly explores that very powerfully. I mean, the abortion series, that's all about shame. I mean, people couldn't have babies because of social shame. I mean, and other circumstances too, poverty and so forth. But yeah.
Well, and I, with regret, have to draw things to a close, but I would like to thank Catherine Lampert and Marina Warner. Thank you so much for talking to us about Paula Rego today, and please go and see the exhibition, which runs until the 19th of April. Thank you.